You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist.
Hi everyone, it's Paige Smathers. Thanks so much for being here. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at positive-nutrition.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this podcast. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast. My name is Paige, and I'm your host. And I want to wish everyone in the U.S. a very happy Independence Day. And when I saw the calendar lining up with the release of this podcast episode, I thought how fun it would be to talk with my guest, who is Dr. Joy Cox, all about kind of surrounding our conversation around these themes of liberation and freedom. And I thought that it would be a fun way to kind of look at those things that we often throw around this time of year in the U.S., talking about freedom and independence. And I think that there's some really important implications of how those themes can run in our lives when it comes to our bodies and when it comes to food. So that's what I'm talking about today with my guest, Joy Cox. Let me quickly introduce her to you. Dr. Joy Cox is a social justice advocate, using her skill set in research and leadership to foster social change through the promotion of diversity and inclusion. Her research in communication focuses on matters of intersectionality, addressing race, body size, accessibility, and health. She's the creator and host of Fresh Out of the Cocoon, a podcast centered on the lived experiences of fat Black women and femmes, and in teaching, she inspires students to find their voice and confidently share ideas, making learning fun, relatable, and empowering. This episode is fantastic. She talks about her dissertation, which is fascinating. She talks about her own personal experiences of sort of the emotional and physical side of liberation when it comes to bodies, when it comes to some of the emotional side of this whole fat liberation, body positivity movement. So if you've ever felt a little bit confused about how does this look in real life, what can I do to make some progress in developing a more positive or gentle or kind approach to my body or to food or my relationship with those things, this episode is going to provide you with a lot of really practical things that you could work on through learning and through learning from Joy and through learning from Joy and through hearing her narrative and her story. I'm so grateful to her for taking the time to share her story and for talking about this really important concept of liberation and freedom. And I think that this is up there with one of the best podcasts I think I've ever been able to record. So I'm really grateful to share it with you today. So a couple things, if you're interested in joining the conversation a little bit further beyond just the podcast, you're welcome to join us over in Facebook. We have a community there called Nutrition Matters Podcast Community. Anyone is welcome to join, and we discuss concepts. I do a couple live videos here and there, and it's a really supportive, fun community. So join us there if you're interested. I have some things coming up in the works that might be interesting to you all, so keep in touch with me. Maybe join my mailing list. You can go to positive-nutrition.com and scroll all the way down to the bottom of the homepage and sign up for updates to the newsletter. So you're welcome to do that if that is something that's easiest for you. Also, you can always follow me on social media. Instagram, Facebook are kind of where I spend most of my time, really Instagram mostly. And I'm at Paige Smathers RD there. I'm going to be coming out with a really, really great resource that I'm really excited about. So that's about to come out and about to be released. So keep in touch with me there. And also be sure to check in on some of the resources that Dr. Joy Cox puts out into the world. She has a fantastic blog. I've loved getting to know her there. Also, her podcast is phenomenal. Social media. Let's just be a part of the conversation. So with that, let's get into the podcast episode for this week, all about letting freedom ring around that concept of independence and freedom and liberation of bodies and emotions. And I'm so positive you're going to enjoy this episode. Thanks again for being here. Well, hello, Dr. Joy Cox. Thanks so much for joining me on Nutrition Matters podcast today.
Hi, Paige. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is a fun topic, and we are releasing this episode on the 4th of July, which in the United States is Independence Day. And so I thought that would be kind of a fun way to kind of introduce the topic we're going to be talking about today. But before we dive into our topic, just take a minute to introduce yourself a little bit, talk about the exciting things that have happened over the last few months for you and kind of what you're up to now professionally.
Okay, great. So I am Joy Cox. I guess you can put the doctor in front of it. I just finished my PhD in March of this year. So I defended my dissertation in March. I walked in May. And so that's probably the most recent thing that has happened for me professionally. I am a lecturer and researcher, and so I actually study communication as in human communication. So I'm interested in the ways in which we interact with one another, the messages that we send and how we send them, which is what my dissertation was kind of was centered on, around matters of identity and social activism, social justice. And so when I'm not, when I'm not doing my own podcast, so I have a podcast called Fresh Off the Cocoon. When I'm not doing my own podcast, I also, I'm researching, I'm writing, I'm teaching, I'm reading, I'm trying to stay up to date on the things that are happening around the idea of fat positivity, body positivity, and what's happening in those circles. But yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell as far as who I am and what's been going on.
So congrats on finishing your PhD. I know that that's not an easy road. So
yeah,
it's done.
Thank you. Yes, it's finished. Woo! Yeah.
What an amazing accomplishment. I love it. So let's just talk really quickly about your dissertation, since that's, maybe you're sick of talking about that or thinking about it at this point, but tell us about what you studied and what you found, and maybe just some of the most interesting things that came from your research. And then I'm also interested in maybe the personal side of why this was a topic you wanted to look into.
Okay, great. So I really don't get to talk as much about my dissertation as people think. So it's always fun to be able to kind of delve into it a little bit and talk about it. So like I said, I studied communication. And so my dissertation was based on matters of identity. So looking at people who identify as being part of the fat positive movement, or fat positivity as we know it. And then I wanted to know about, the organizations that they were affiliated with, and in what ways has fat positivity been kind of hindered or pushed forward as a result. And so I kind of went into this project. So I'm going to kind of mingle my personal and
perfect. That's great.
In the story, if that's fine.
Yeah.
So I kind of went into this project wanting to know more about the visibility that fat people have in society, and what hinders us, because I'm a fat person, hinders us from being recognized. So kind of a little bit of history with the fat positive movement. It's been around arguably since the civil rights movement. So one of the first organizations that was started around this idea of fat positivity was, it's called NAAFA. And it was actually modeled after the NAACP. So NAAFA is the NAAFA. And so I was interested in kind of looking at this, one, for my own personal reasons, wanting to know about the ways that advocacy is taking place in fat positive circles. And then also because understanding and realizing that although I'm also African American and although I'm also a woman, that I did have a certain position of privilege and a position of power that enabled me to write about something that I knew would be published. Like I knew someone somewhere had to read it.
Right.
And if that was the way that I could spread education about this topic or about weight stigma, then that was the position that I was going to take. And so I kind of set out to do this project, and I collected a lot of data. My dissertation consisted of a content analysis. So I analyzed Facebook posts, I analyzed TV shows, and then I analyzed some blog posts as well as in-depth interviews. So after I looked at all of that material, then I went back and asked people who self-identified as being members of the movement their thoughts and feelings about certain topics. And so it was a lot of data. It was a lot of hours. Not too many sleepless nights, but nights that I slept little.
Little sleep
and so
nights.
Right. And so I guess some of the biggest findings that I found is that oftentimes when we talk about weight stigma and when we talk about issues that are related to the treatment of fat individuals in society, we typically look at this as society's problem, which I don't deny, right, on any platform. I think that fat people endure a lot of harsh treatment and a lot of restrictions in society based on the way that we're treated and the practices that are enacted by society as a whole, as a large, because diet culture is everywhere and you can't really get rid of it.
Right.
But for me, I think some of the more interesting findings that I found was the ways in which the movement, members of the movement spoke about things that hindered them from people within their own circles. And so now we're dealing with, how you come to a place for liberation or you come to a place for freedom, and you find that there are still barriers that are in this place that doesn't allow you to move forward. So the place, again, that's supposed to kind of bring you liberty also is hindering you from making progress.
So you're saying you do, let me make sure I'm understanding. So you're saying you do all this work to find like liberation and freedom in your own body and in your own life, and then you find communities that are supportive of that, but then within those supportive communities there are some barriers to those communities. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Or am I hearing you wrong?
Right. No. That's exactly what I'm saying. And so what I was finding is that, made up of what we would call fat positivity, there are still people that ascribe to diet culture in some ways. There are some people who struggle with other facets of fat positivity. So matters of intersectionality. What does it mean to be fat and disabled? What does it mean to be fat and Black? What does it mean to be fat and poor? Those are things that tend to hinder the progress of moving forward a lot in these different groups. And so you had this society portion where it's very visible. And I think these are the things that we often focus on the most when we're talking about, fat positivity, because this is where we want our rights and this is where we want that liberty, that freedom to kind of live and breathe. But when you get into these different pockets of community, then you still have these other battles that you have to fight. And so
communities are imperfect and they can did you notice in your research or in your own personal life, your observations, I'll just say that communities form and they have the best intentions and things are good, but a lot of these communities are online. It's harder to communicate and to really hear each other when it's all via, typing and reading rather than being together. There's a lot that can be kind of lost in translation, a lot of confusion and maybe getting more offended or just, do you find that there's imperfections in just the way we're creating communities?
Sure. And so, that was kind of a focal point of my dissertation, that a lot of what was happening actually happens online. And previous research would state that that's really not a way to sustain a movement. And so even though you have even though you have this, we have this power of social media. We have this power of, things happening around us and people being able to use blogs and Twitter and Facebook to kind of push forward and what they believe. There is a lack of what's happening personally or in face-to-face type of communication. And that's like the organizing piece that, at least in my opinion, based on my interviews and what I've analyzed, actually hinders the movement an awful lot. Because they don't see you. People had, there were some interviewees, they had a problem with being seen. They didn't want to be seen in public. Like their worst fear was to be made, like the worst fear was like, I don't want to be made into a meme.
Right.
Like, so they didn't want that. Other people had access issues. So maybe they can't walk in March. They can't do these things. So what is available to people who deal with mobility issues and visibility? But at the same time, it's like this issue of being able to actually organize and put feet on the ground and show up and be present. That's something also that I found kind of lags in social activism as far as what we know. So a lot of stuff is happening online. A lot of things are fragmented because things are happening online, and there's not a hub where everybody can come together and get ideas.
Right. And actually just collaborate, communicate, sit with each other, listen to each other, see each other's faces. All of that makes such a difference.
Right. And I mean, again, if you look at prior research about social movement organizations, meeting in person is kind of the thing that keeps the movement hinged, kind of keeps it together.
Yeah.
You're meeting people, you're interacting with people. And so, there's a lot of talk about how social media is kind of replacing the interactions that we do with one another, but not really, because there's still this gap, right, that needs to be filled by face-to-face interactions, and that you're not going to be able to kind of mitigate or get rid of, so to speak, just because you can, FaceTime someone.
Yeah, that's really super interesting research. And it makes intuitive sense to me that getting together would be important. I wasn't familiar with the fact that there's research to support that when it comes to social movement. That makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you've used the term fat positivity and body positivity. Do you want to just take a minute to kind of talk about what those terms mean and help everybody? I just am always sensitive. This might be someone's first time hearing some of these terms. So just take a minute to talk about what that means.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with body positivity because I think that's something that's probably more mainstream. And so when I talk about body positivity, what I'm talking about is the more mainstream version of what previously was known as fat positivity. And so body positivity is this idea that you can accept yourself as is without any changes. And you can be confident and sure in who you are as an individual, right? And so if you have stretch marks, you're accepting yourself with those stretch marks. If you have body hair, you're letting it grow and you're accepting yourself as such. And I kind of use body positivity along with fat positivity because many people know body positivity and they can kind of resonate with that. A lot less people know fat positivity. And so fat positivity, the way that I define it, is very similar to body positivity, except that it's about you accepting your fatness. It's about you accepting who you are in your body as is. There is no, there's no motivation, I guess, so to speak, or you're not trying to change your body through dieting, through food restrictions, things of that nature. You're looking in the mirror, you're appreciating yourself for who you are, as you are. You're understanding that fat is not it's not a value judgment against who you are as an individual. It just is, right? Like it's a descriptor. It's not bad, or it's not bad or good or any of those things. You're not assessing a value to yourself based on the type of body that you have. And so historically, looking at fat positivity and body positivity, the original body positive movement, so to speak, actually sprung out of what we now call fat positivity. And then over time, what wound up happening is that the movement in and of itself got co-opted. And then you had smaller bodies flooding the position of body positivity and ultimately muting the voices of fat bodies, which is not uncommon in the history of what we see. I mean, I think people can see that in mainstream everywhere. Everywhere you go, even if you're looking at Lane Bryant, if you're looking at Torrid or these other places, you're seeing certain fat bodies, specific types of fat bodies. But oftentimes the people who start out doing the work are not the people who get recognized, or the larger bodies. So, you have the larger bodies that can't purchase certain clothes in the store are typically the people who are speaking on behalf of bodies or on behalf of body liberation. But, when Lane Bryant puts their people in the windows, they're 1Xs or they're 2Xs. And so you have this more acceptable form of a body that's flowing through mainstream, but the people who are actually doing the work are the ones who are being shut out.
That's so sad. And
yeah.
just speaking about the clothes thing, so much of the feedback I get from clients or from friends or from these circles we're talking about is just, it only goes up to a certain size. And then from there, the clothes are not flattering, or you don't enjoy them, or they're not the type, they're not as cute as they could be because they're just kind of thrown together. And a lot of my clients will say, well, I really care about fashion. I care about, I want to wear something that I feel good in, but I can't even find those clothes, which is a huge problem.
Right. And I mean, aside from not being able to find them, my shirt costs 2 or 3 times more than the person who has a medium shirt, right? And there isn't a price difference between a small, a medium, and a large, and oftentimes even an extra large. But it's almost as though being larger in size penalizes you in more than one way. So not only can you not find clothes, or once you find them, they're not flattering, but then you also have to pay 3 times as much for something that's not flattering, that you had to spend twice as much time to find.
How frustrating.
And so, there's a lot of restriction in that. And you got to think about the people who are actually designing the clothes, because if they're designing the clothes through a more anti-fat type mindset, they're designing clothes that hide you, that cover you, that wants to make you less appealing, because that's how they feel like you would want to be, or you would want to, you want to see
yourself. Not with the mindset of like, oh, what could be cute and fun and flowy and feel good for the weather or whatever it is. It's like, okay, how can we hide?
Right. So let's just put a bunch of flowers on it, and hopefully, I guess they'll blend in with the garden. Or, we're only gonna produce clothes in black or in brown.
Right. The color.
Or, dark colors that help people fade, And the truth of the matter is, if you're a 3X and you wear black, you're going to look like a black 3X. If you're a 3X and you wear, if you're a 5X and you wear brown, you're going to look like a 5 brown X. This idea that these colors shape and hide certain things. For who? For what? In pictures? I mean, you don't get smaller having to sit on the seat because you wear black and you're a 3X. Like, the hope would be that the seat accommodates you, period. So.
Amen to that. The clothing thing is a part of our culture that definitely needs to change. I didn't realize that there was even a price difference. It's almost like a tax.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what a lot of people actually call it, like the fat tax, right? The extra amount of money that larger people have to pay, due to being larger in size. I mean, that's the same thing for airplane tickets, right? So you're paying for 2 airplane tickets if your leg crosses over too far, or, all of those different things that penalize you for being in the body that you're in. And I mean, kind of just quickly hopping back to my dissertation, that was one of the things that I looked at, thinking about discourses and how we talk about inclusion often in society, how we're accepting of everyone. But if I go into a room and the room has 16-inch seats and those seats have arms on them, the practices that are exhibited by institutions or by structures tell me that I'm not welcome, even though it may be written somewhere or posted or they say something like, no, these seats don't fit. So obviously it says who you want in the room.
That's such an important point. And I think it's something that if you live in a smaller body, you don't necessarily think of that stuff, but it's conversations hopefully like these and the ones you have on your podcast and your dissertation and the awesome things you're putting out into the world. Hopefully people are starting to think about that. What type of chairs do I have in my office? What type of, is it going to be comfortable and feel good for people of all sizes? That's not necessarily something that people in smaller bodies think about.
Right.
But they should. So talk a little bit about the term fat liberation.
So fat liberation was initially was the term that was used when fat positivity first kind of came out on the scene. It was really about fat liberation. And this is, again, I mean, we've switched the word to fat positivity. And so they're kind of interchangeable in that regard. Fat liberation was just an original term that I actually take to a little bit more, because to me, it is more about liberating yourself or being free from the societal pressure of conforming or forcing your body to conform to an ideal. And should I also add that it's a westernized ideal about what bodies should look like. And so being a Black woman, I seek liberation on a number of different levels, and allowing my body to breathe and be what it is in all its glory is one of those things. And so not just liberation physically, but liberation emotionally, liberation through our mindsets, being able to detach ourselves from diet culture, detach ourselves from westernized ideals, and kind of subscribing to a philosophy that says it's okay to be you. I mean, it's okay to have chubby cheeks and and flappy arms and a belly and a shape that doesn't work like a Coke bottle. I mean, when you really think about it, like, Coke bottles have not been around for that long. And the idea that we force ourselves or even believe that our bodies are supposed to fit that way is a little weird, but yeah, so that's what fat liberation kind of means, at least to me, the way that I define it, as being free from the societal pressures to conform, and then also allow my body to be free.
Yeah, exactly. And isn't that what everybody wants? Like, that just seems so very human. Like, I think we all just want to be able to be ourselves and to be able to have community and feel worthy and have love and have meaning in our lives. That's really what we want. And so when you talk about fat liberation, fat positivity, I think people can we talked before we started recording how people can get really riled up about that. And it can really feel like you're attacking their identity or their way of life. Maybe they want to be dieting and they want to not believe that that acceptance is a powerful thing when it comes to bodies and things like that. But I think that's just so very human, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think the other aspect of that is that we want community and we want freedom. We want liberty. We want that. But we also want to be accepted. And I feel like in some ways that often is the piece, that place of tension, where, the idea is that if I live my life in X, Y, and Z type of fashion, then I'm not going to be accepted. And so we find those ways to we are constantly fighting with the idea of acceptance, right? Like, you want to be able to walk into a room and be accepted. You want to be able to get on a plane and not have people turn their faces up towards you because your body is larger. But if over time people have been taught that your body isn't acceptable, then it's also kind of divesting from those thoughts and those mindsets. And so the hope is that not only are we finding community and we're finding those things, but that we're also finding acceptance. And I feel like sometimes that's where, like you said when we were talking earlier, that's where the struggle is, right? Because people are not willing to accept. They're not willing to accept, like, hey, dieting does have a 95% failure rate.
Right.
And so there's so much animosity and so much offense that's built up in statements like that for people who want to do the other thing, or people who see fat people having fun living their life. It's very hard for them to accept that. And so then you get that pushback. Oh, you're glorifying an unhealthy lifestyle and all of these other things. And I think, when we dig deeper, we have to ask ourselves, why? Where's that problem coming from? Like, why do you have this issue with accepting other people being able to live a life, even if that life isn't yours? Like,
Right.
It's not your life at all. So why does that get you so riled up? Why does it bother you?
Yeah, these are questions we all need to ask ourselves and assess on a regular basis. Like, if that's bringing that up for you, of you're glorifying an unhealthy lifestyle, you need to do more work. And that's okay. Like, that's okay to be aware of that. It's actually really good. But definitely the idea of policing people having fun is just a little bit ridiculous if you put it that way. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit about your personal experience when you talk about liberation and finding freedom, kind of in the theme of the day that we're releasing this episode. You mentioned that there's definitely like a physical liberation that happens, but also there's this emotional side. So I thought maybe it would be fun to dive into both of those aspects a little bit and talk about, like, what did it look like for you on a physical level to embrace this idea of liberation, fat liberation?
Sure. So I've been fat my whole life. And so that has always been, it's always been a constant, but for sure, without having a term to kind of, I guess, define what I was living through at the time, I think I've always been an advocate for my own body. And so, I mean, I can remember being young and having to advocate for myself at the doctor's office. The doctor would talk to me or talk to my mom. The doctor would talk to my mom as though I wasn't in the room, or if I had to go by myself. And they would talk about my body, talk about my weight and different things. And I remember one day I got fed up and I said, at the time, I said, I'll lose weight whenever I get ready. And like everybody kind of got quiet. They give you back then they would give me a sheet, all the list of foods that I needed to eat and all of this other stuff. And I just got really tired of being reduced to just a number on the scale. And so I can remember being, perturbed about that. And as time went on, I mean, for a good portion of my life, I did buy into diet culture. So there were, there were workout regimens, there were, diets, you eat a certain way, you do this, you do that. And in 2011, I kind of I set my sights and I got serious and I said, okay, I wanted to be smaller. I didn't want to be skinny or, super small. But I said, I want to be smaller than what I am right now. And I started to diet. And I dieted and I worked out and I lost about, I don't know, around, I guess it was like 40 something pounds, around that amount. And one of the first alarms that went off was that I graduated I got my undergrad. I was living in West Virginia at the time, and they threw me a graduation party. This graduation party had like watermelon and, hot dogs or whatever else. But the graduation party was only for one day. So, I enjoyed myself. I ate my watermelon. I did all of these things. And then everybody went home. And then, it was back to whatever diet I was subscribing to at the time. And I remember stepping on the scale and being 10 pounds heavier than
after one day of eating
after
a
one
hot dog.
Right.
Wow.
And I remember being so angry and so upset. And at the time there was like a support forum. So I went and I'm typing and I'm asking questions like, this doesn't make sense. What happened here? And people are like, well, what did you eat? I said, well, all I had was watermelon, some barbecue food. And they was like, well, yeah, that could do it. And I'm thinking, no, that's not possible. Like, how do you gain 10 pounds in this small window of time? And I think that was the first time I started to raise my eyebrow about like weight and how much it mattered to me. And then time would go on, so I was like, whatever, I got to get back on track like everybody pretty much does. And I started to notice like my body didn't look any different, or, I was still doing the things that I was doing before. But here I had this obsession with this number, like what this number had to be. And if I stepped on this scale and I was 2 pounds heavier, then I was depressed. I was upset with myself. What do I need to do? And when I relocated to Missouri to do my master's degree, I remember at one point just telling myself like, Joy, just take 2 weeks off. Like, this is taking up way too much of your mental energy. Something isn't right. Like, take 2 weeks off, recharge yourself. Like, because at this point I can see how being, restricting my eating and doing all of these different things is really starting to impact me negatively, emotionally and mentally, right? And this is not to mention the fact that at times, I don't think a lot of people talk about this, but like when you are physically pushing yourself, I was in pain. I was just sore. My body hurt all the time. Like my knees would hurt or different things like that. So it wasn't just me. I'm getting smaller, but I'm also paying a price for this. And
right.
Like you start to ask yourself, to what degree or to what extent, how much are you willing to pay? And so I started to make decisions and just say, I had to switch. And gradually this started to happen, just like, not being concerned about what I weighed. I was more concerned about, am I active? And towards,
was some of this an intellectual thing, like getting into grad school, and like there is a lot of evidence that movement and exercise are independently good for our health, regardless of what happens to our weight as a result of moving, right? So was some of this logical, or was this a lot of this kind of more of intuitive, like, oh, I just feel like this isn't right for me, or this isn't working for me?
So, I think now it's me being able to move my body, because in 2015, I actually, I had a pulmonary embolism and for people who don't know what that is, maybe I should tell you. So I had blood clots in my lungs, and one of them restricted my airway, and I wound up passing out outside. And this wasn't from dieting. This is from me being on birth control. And then being mindful of that and realizing that my whole life I've been active. Like my whole life I've been doing this without this extra component of dieting, without this extra component of being so overly obsessed with my body. For me, I think it was more intuitive that like, hey, you don't need to live like this. Like something just isn't clicking, something isn't right. And this plan that you originally started to subscribe to doesn't work. It doesn't work. And honestly, working backwards, so working from that place and then reading research, I was like, oh, because now like you start to find out like, okay, now you find the literature that says 95% of diets don't work. You find the literature that talks about the ways in which your body reacts, that when you start to deprive it of foods, it slows down your metabolism on purpose so that you start to gain weight back and all of these things. You start to realize that, oh, you probably threw yourself into a place of starvation. And even though you thought you were doing a good thing, you really weren't. But at the time, I didn't know any of that stuff.
Okay.
So for me, it was more like, I don't like the way I feel. I don't like the way that this is making me think about food. Like, I never thought about food so much in my life until I decided to restrict myself. Like,
which is
you know
exactly
what I mean?
what your body is like programmed to get you to do, right?
Exactly.
When you start restricting it, you're supposed to get really motivated to find it.
Right. And so I didn't like that. Me personally, I didn't like the way that this was something that started out as recreational actually started to be like a primary focus, like in my life. And I said, you got to make some, like now I'm coming back to the drawing board and saying, let's make some other changes. And then, just going through life, the next couple years after that, like I said, in 2015, after having a pulmonary embolism and just reevaluating and saying there are so many other things that are so much important. This is nothing. Like, this is your body functions. It works the way that it's supposed to. You're happy with yourself. Why do all this extra stuff? Right? Like, why subscribe to a certain ideology about your body being less than or not good enough or whatever? For what? What is the point? And so for me, I had to make a decision about changing again, like reverting back to and saying, being willing to accept myself. And I mean, I think finding literature about it, finding research about it, being part of communities, hearing other people's stories, really helped me in that regard to be able to be like, it is what it is. And, and I'm still active and I'm still moving and I'm still doing all these things and life is grand and I'm okay with that.
Getting PhDs.
But yeah, for a good 2-3 years. Yeah, getting PhDs, getting master's degrees, and and this should not be a thing. Like, this should really not. I mean, when you sit down and you think about it, you're a great person. You have a great support system. You have a great friends, families. Like, you have all of these things, great relationships. You're accomplishing great things, and really, you're not happy with yourself because when you stepped on the scale, it told you that your body was a certain weight, and now like your whole day is ruined.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, there has to be something, like something has to click that says it's not worth it. And for me, I had to come to that point and say, I'm okay with it not being worth it, and I'm going to do something different.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. I loved it. Another thing that I would just wonder for you, a lot of my clients report that part of this like physical process of liberating yourself from diet culture is refusing to like put your life on hold and doing things like just living life, like going to concerts, going on trips, putting on a bathing suit, enjoying life rather than feeling like, well, I can't live until I lose X amount of pounds or whatever.
Right. And I mean, definitely the same. I think, now being where I am now, and I'll say this because it doesn't bother me, but I'm 35 years old and I decided to go back to school when I was 25. And if I would have put off going back to school, like I don't have time to put off things anymore. Like, so if I'd have put off going back to school, waiting until I lost weight, and not to mention that for some people, it's going to be physically impossible for you to even be the size that you have envisioned in your mind, like what you want to be. And so you run the risk of like never doing things, never venturing out, never flying on a plane, never just achieving your goals, never traveling. And it's like you got to get to a point to where you're willing to say like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go and buy a bathing suit. Like I just went, well, not funny story, but I just went to, I went to a store and I had to return some clothes because I didn't like the way that they fit, but all of them were like sleeveless. And the girl who I was returning the clothes to, she was looking at them. She was like, did they not fit? I said, well, they didn't fit right. I didn't like the way that they kind of looked on my body. Like the cuts, it was, I don't know. They weren't sewn to the way that I liked them. And she said, I think that these are nice, but I have an arm problem. Like I have a fat arm problem is what she said. And so she is refusing to wear certain clothes because they leave her arms out. And it's like, okay, but like I live on the East Coast where it's humid and it's 95 degrees outside, and you rather sweat through your clothes than show your arms. Who's going to wait until you lose enough weight before you don't sweat to death, or you don't, there's no heat exhaustion. But people do that, and they do it regularly. And I think that, it's like, I forget what, I think it's like deferred satisfaction, for lack of better, I believe that's the term. And so it's kind of like when we are in these places, you have to make decisions about how you want to live your life. Like, I'm not going to sweat. I just refuse. I'm not going to allow myself to be overheated because I need to lose 15 pounds so my arms can be smaller.
Or I'm going to spare
I'm not going to take a trip
to have to see my arms. Or that's sometimes the mentality too, is like,
right,
I don't want to get the looks, or I don't want people to say something or think something negative about me. Right.
And it's like, these chubby arms need to breathe just like smaller arms need to breathe.
Yeah.
Like, I have a type of attitude about, like, people will deal. Like, they may look at them and they may turn their noses up, but at the end of the day, I don't know you and I'm not going to see you ever again. So,
honestly, and that's on them too. Like, right. That's not your fault. That's not your problem. That's not you didn't cause them to have that reaction. That was their thing. And in fact, that says a lot about it gives sort of an insight into what's going on for that person, if that's the reaction they're having. And, we can just kind of look at it that way, like, oh, your reaction to me is about you. It's not about me.
Right. Right.
So
Absolutely.
much easier said than done, but.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, I love that description of that physical aspect of what you're talking about with liberation, but I'm really interested to hear, what kind of emotional work did you do, or are you doing, or have you done in your life where you felt something clicked, where you were feeling like, oh, I feel free. That new paradigm shift or that new approach has really opened my mind or freed me or liberated me. Is there anything that's coming to mind? I know that's kind of a big question, but.
I think for me, the emotional piece has been ongoing. Like, there are days and there are times. It's really interesting because sometimes the times when I find myself, most beautiful, I guess, if that's the term that you want to use, but it's like when I'm sweaty and when I'm like undone, when I'm not put together, when I'm not, gathered, so to speak. And I've been able to kind of find acceptance in myself through the messy stuff. And by being able to find acceptance in myself through the messy stuff, then the times when I'm, dressed up and all of that other stuff is like extra. But like walking through, sitting with myself, unpacking different feelings, different experiences that happened to me when I was younger, or, if I see old pictures of myself, it's like, I might look at them and there was a time when I like didn't like them because, maybe maybe I had a double chin, or maybe my stomach was showing, or maybe my thighs were out too much and all of that other stuff. But kind of sitting with that and unpacking it has helped for me emotionally, kind of going back through and saying, why don't you feel like, why did you feel this way about this? Or why did you think this about yourself back then versus now? And I mean, I'll be honest, there are times when I hope this isn't inappropriate, but there are times when I just I'll stand in front of the mirror, like without any clothes on, and just look at myself. To really look at myself, not like glance, not just to look at myself and look at my body and appreciate it. And there was a time like when I couldn't do that. But now, like, being able to kind of come face to face, because oftentimes we like walk and we glance and it's like, oh, I don't want to see this. I don't want to look. No, I stop and I actually look, because it's my body and my body works for me and it does great things for me. And it's continuing to do great things for me. And so the emotional part is unpacking those things and kind of facing who I am daily, because we face diet culture every day and there's always something somewhere that's coming up. I've also learned to like divest from people and things that no longer serve me a purpose as far as being fat positive is concerned. So I don't follow pages that talk about weight loss and the diet industry as something to be admired. I also am not connected with people who think that fat people are funny, like who make funny jokes about fat bodies, people who have negative ideas about fatness. I tend not to engage with them as much, because what I've realized is that they may walk away and they're fine, but I walk away carrying that weight. And then that's more stuff that I have to unpack later that I'd rather not engage in. I'm not going to carry extra weight, no pun intended, if I don't have to.
No. Wow, Joy,
and so
this is so beautiful. Everything you're saying, I'm just like nodding my head and just loving. Can I just rewind back to your part where you talked about looking at yourself, really looking at yourself, naked in the mirror. First of all, that's not inappropriate. I think that's such a beautiful thing and such a great just idea that might be extremely hard for some, maybe easier for others. But I'm wondering, doing that for you, have you noticed that is helpful in terms of creating a connection with your body? And what I mean by that is, so often we're glancing, like you said, or kind of trying not to see, or seeing it in like a window randomly because you never look in the mirror, and then being grossed out, or whatever you say to yourself in your own head. Mm-hmm. But I often am trying to help people connect to themselves and connect to their body, and not, a lot of people report like, I wish it just was like a head floating without a body. I think looking at it and seeing it and really seeing it seems like such a powerful step in the right direction toward connecting with it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think, connecting and saying, okay, so for me, because after I'm standing there and I'm looking, right, obviously then you start to move a little, right? And so it's like, yeah, and these are my arms, and these are my legs, and these are, and oh, this is like I'm turning my body certain ways and I'm doing different things. And so it's like, I think in that moment, like my mind and my body become one. Like, this is me. Like, it's not like this is me with a body. No, like, this is me.
Yeah.
And being able to say, yeah, like, it's almost like, when you see young kids who notice their reflection for the first time and they are elated and they're overjoyed and then they can't, right. And then they can't like look away, right? Because they're enjoying themselves so much. It's kind of like reconnecting back to that place and saying like, yeah, like this is me, and not looking at just parts. Because one of the things that I think is true about this society and how we objectify bodies, like you carry that with you. And then internally, we start to look at our bodies just as parts. This is my stomach. This is my legs. These are my arms, right? And so oftentimes we are separating ourselves and valuing our body parts instead of valuing our whole person. And so for me, that's just a way to connect back and say, yeah, like all of you, all of me. And it's weird because when I do those types of things, it's almost like the size of your body, all of that stuff kind of starts to melt away. And the only thing that's standing there is like you authentically as an individual. And not like, again, not these parts, not this stomach, not these hips, not these toes. No, it's just you, who you are.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I've never heard someone talk about that in that way, like in just such a beautiful, meaningful, just, I think we all can connect to how powerful it is, what you just said. So thank you for that. Would you add anything else to your process of emotional liberation?
Process of emotional liberation. I mean, besides support systems, besides having people that can understand and relate to the things that you kind of go through living in a fat body. I mean, I think I've become a lot more gentler with myself over time. Like I'm the type of person that hugs myself. But just learn being kinder to yourself. And I think because I'm so rigid in other things, like whether it's the work that I do, you know, all of that stuff, like, but being kinder to myself and understanding, you know, having compassionate empathy, like understanding, you know, there was a time when I'd be out running around all day from morning to night. It's like 10 o'clock at night. And then I'm beating myself up about not working out or, not back then it was like not eating every 4 hours or what have you. And it's like, yeah, but when you start to realize like you're human too, like you have to take care of the body that you have and being able to say, okay, well, if you don't want to do, if you don't want to do tonight, then if you don't want to work out tonight, if you don't want to move your body, go to sleep. Like that is just as much important as it is doing these extra activities that you think that you need to do or that you have to do. So I think emotionally, I think I've become kinder to myself, gentler with myself. And I've given myself space and liberty to actually do what's in my heart. Like asking myself, like, do you want to do this? Because I don't think oftentimes, I mean, the way that we're programmed in society is that we're told what to do. We get up every morning and we go to work because that's the type of life that we've been told we're supposed to have. You're supposed to be 18. You're supposed to go to school, go to college, get a degree, get a job, start a family, et cetera, et cetera. And so in a lot of ways, society has already carved a path that you're supposed to follow. And most of us get up and follow that routine. We look for that where we are in our lives. We look to meet somebody. We look to know them maybe for 2 years or whatever. We look to be engaged. We look to be married, et cetera, et cetera. But I've been able to kind of stop and say, okay, what do you want to do? What's next? What's on the agenda today? Some days I get up and it's like, okay, well, I don't want to do anything. And that's okay. And then there are other days when I get up and I feel like, I want to take on the world. And that's okay too. But it's also okay to take breaks. And it's also okay to, it's also okay to rest. And so I think emotionally I've learned to be kinder to me. I'm good at being kind to everybody else.
Yeah, right.
I'm great at being understanding to everyone else. But it's me often that gets left in the dust. And I had to kind of come back to that place and say, what do you want to do? How are you feeling today? Things like that.
It's like that compassionate voice that we kind of have to like self-parent ourselves and treat ourselves as someone we really, really love, rather than,
right.
cracking the whip and, being super mean to ourselves. It's not like good stuff comes from that, right? It's not
right.
you don't really yell at your kids to get them to do stuff. I mean, yeah, sometimes you have to and sometimes it happens,
right.
but you probably we've all had the experience that being a little bit kind and asking questions and being nurturing with people typically helps us get a lot further than being really mean.
Right. And again, it goes back to, we don't like it when people do it to us, right? If somebody was yelling and screaming at me, calling me a loser, all this other stuff, I would know right away that's not a person that I want in my life. And I'm not going to tolerate people treating me that way. But throughout the day, we share those messages with ourselves. Throughout the day, we talk to ourselves in those ways. And that doesn't help either, because it's self-defeating, right? So even when there are no opposition, like very much kind of like going back to what I was talking about earlier in reference to my dissertation, if society didn't exist, right? If there was no opposition to fatness, we still would have to deal with our own community. We still would have to deal with the ways in which we encounter self-defeating messages. And so it's the same thing. It's the same idea. And so I had to kind of clean that up within myself so that I would feel better about me.
It seems like, for what it's worth, it seems like you're doing an incredible job with that. Like, really, I'm just so inspired by everything you've said.
I'm trying every day,
right?
Every day. I mean, some days are better than others, but, and then some days it's like you got to catch yourself. You can be in the middle of a rant thinking about things that you ought not. But having that composure to say, whoa, take a step back, breathe, gather yourself, and then let's work and move forward. Yeah.
Right. And that's such a good point, that it's not just, well, now I've arrived and I never have self-defeating thoughts and I am always just so perfect at being compassionate with myself. Like, yeah. I think it's a really important thing to just nod to the fact that those thoughts still come up, and you still, might let them kind of linger and simmer in your mind. But at some point you say, wait a minute, where am I right now? And how do I need to kind of take a step back and, like you said, breathe and kind of center and refocus on what I know works for me and what I know makes me feel my best.
Right.
Perfect. So, Joy, will you just take a minute to talk about how people can follow you and your work and maybe listen to your podcast, all of that stuff?
Sure. So I am currently, so my podcast is, so the podcast name is Fresh Out the Cocoon. I'm on pretty much every, podcast platform outside of Spotify and iHeartRadio. So you can find me on Apple Podcasts, Breaker Radio, Google Play Music, SoundCloud, and TuneIn Radio. In addition to that, I also have an Instagram page that's Fresh Out the Cocoon, where I post nice things. There, I have a Facebook page, Fresh Out the Cocoon, and then on Twitter, I'm FOTC_podcast. Fresh Out the Cocoon also has a page where I sell merchandise, so t-shirts, fat positive, body positive t-shirts that people can get. And I don't raise my prices regardless of the size that you are. So everybody pays the same amount for the same price of the shirt, which also has a blog where you can stay up to date on the things that I ponder during the day. And also I try to link my podcast episodes to the blog. So if people go to the website, they don't have to click so many times to get from one place to the next.
That's great. And I really enjoy your blog. That's part of how I got to know you, and really appreciate the stuff you're putting out into the world. You're doing incredible work. Thank you.
Thank you. And likewise.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.